Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, it's been a terrible week for the Tories. Chunks of the budget being torn up, enormous fines from the Electoral Commission, as we were saying, and a very bitter row between Theresa May and Nicola Sturgeon about Scotland's right to have a second independence referendum. Ruth Davidson is leader of the opposition in Scotland, and she joins me from Glasgow now. Good morning, Ruth Davidson.
Good morning to you, Andrew.
You said not so long ago that I actually don't think that Westminster saying no ye canny to a Scottish referendum would play very well in Scotland and it would damage the unionist cause. Have you changed your mind?
Well, that's not what Theresa May said. She said that now is not the time, and on a point of principle, she said that to have a fair referendum, the people of Scotland need to know what it is they're voting for. They need to know what Brexit looks like, so it's got to be after the Brexit process has played out, and crucially, they also need to know what independence looks like. And I think it's astonishing that after a two-day conference in Aberdeen, the SNP haven't still told us what their vision is for independence after dropping this bombshell on Monday.
Unless the government are astonishingly incompetent on Nicola Sturgeon's timescale, we will know pretty clearly what the Brexit deal will be at that point. So what's the problem with the referendum?
Well, no, I don't accept that at all, Andrew, on the grounds that we also know that there's going to be an awful lot of powers that come back from Brussels. Now, many of them are going to be devolved to the Scottish Parliament. The same powers, actually, that Nicola wants to hand back to Brussels that we believe in. So we won't know. But like I say, we also don't know what independence looks like. We have asked basic questions on things like currency, on things like a central bank, on things like whether we would even rejoin Europe as a full member. And Nicola Sturgeon seems unable to commit to that. And the other issue is, I don't think that you can have an independence referendum again, Andrew, if you don't have public consent for it. And the people of Scotland don't want this. We see another poll today to add to the many dozen that we've seen since June of last year that shows that the majority of people in Scotland don't want this. And I know that this is hard. I know that it's hard from 450 miles away, Andrew. But what I have to tell you, and I have to tell people at home, no. From 450 miles away, I know it's difficult because I've read all this week, all of these people in London newsrooms that have been writing about Scotland, and I have to tell people the SNP is not Scotland, and they're acting against the majority wishes of the people of Scotland in what they put forward in their proposition on Monday. And I've just read far too many headlines saying Scotland reacts X or Scotland reacts Y. No, it doesn't. There are people right across Scotland, many, many thousands of them, that are so thankful for the Prime Minister to actually say, let's take a pause on this.
OK, well, let's take a pause on that. Let me put it to you that the SNP is nonetheless the government of Scotland, and they were elected on a manifesto which said with crystal clarity that if Scotland was taken out of the EU against her wishes, that would be the material change which would signal another referendum. And therefore, whatever you think of Nicola Sturgeon, she is, unlike some other parties we could mention, sticking by her manifesto commitment.
Well, she also lost her majority at the very same election that you're talking about. And during that entire election campaign, and I know because I was standing on a podium right next to her in the TV studios as she said it, she also told the people of Scotland directly that if I don't change people's minds on this, if more and more people don't want it, if I don't get people across the line to independence, I will have no right to hold one. She looked down a TV camera lens and spoke to the people of Scotland, and she said those very words. She said that if she hadn't changed public opinion in Scotland, she would have no right to call one. And that matters too, Andrew.
So what's your message to all those people in Scotland who look at the prospect of leaving the EU and agree with what you used to say about it crashing the Scottish economy and being devastating for jobs and prosperity and the future of the Scottish economy, and who want to stay inside the single market and want one last chance to say we don't agree with this and we want to go in a different direction? And you and your leader in London are taking that possibility away from them.
Well, I will point to Theresa May's Lancaster House speech, where she said that she wants to be able to pursue a free trade deal that allows companies in Scotland, as well as companies in the rest of the UK, to trade freely with and operate within that single market, as well as look for trade deals abroad. I would also point to some of the other 12 points that were in Theresa May's plan, ones that the SNP asked for. Now, you wouldn't think it from the way Nicola Sturgeon's talking, but things like close cooperation on crime and intelligence gathering, things like workers' rights, things like rights for EU EU migrants living in the UK. These were all things specifically asked for by the SNP government that they will not acknowledge was detailed in that Lancaster House speech by Theresa May.
Which haven't been included in the legislation that's just gone through Parliament, of course, those things. Can you point me to a single actual change in policy or direction that Theresa May has conceded to the Scottish Government? Because she said at the beginning she'd be listening to Scotland, nothing would happen without Scotland's say-so and consent. And it seems since then there has been a deafening silence.
Well, you've seen all of the JMC, that's the Joint Ministerial Council meetings that have been going on between the UK government and the devolved administrations. I've just literally detailed 4 points out of the 12-point plan that were specifically asked for by the SNP government. Now, I know that if Theresa May wrapped up a pony in a big bow and gave it to Nicola Sturgeon for her birthday, for some reason that wouldn't be enough, and there would continue to be grievance.
Slightly strange thing to do, but yes, I take your point.
There would still be grievance, but these are things that were specifically asked for by the Scottish Government that have been delivered and laid out by the UK government. Now, Nicola Sturgeon might not wish to acknowledge that, but there's a reason for that, because she is hell-bent on the separation of this country. We've seen it this week. She wants to do it against the majority wishes of the Scottish people. And we are seeing, because, and this is important, Andrew, just one more point before we move on. And we know that Brexit is only this week's excuse, and there have been plenty of excuses in the past, because when asked, Nicola Sturgeon was asked, will you take an independent Scotland directly back in as a full member of the EU immediately if you win independence? And she refused to confirm it. So this isn't about Brexit. This is about utilising whatever is to hand to try and break up the UK, because that's been Nicola Sturgeon's political mission for her entire life.
She is leader of the SNP, so it's not surprising. But nonetheless...
But she's doing it against the wishes of Scotland, and she's also the First Minister of Scotland.
Opinion polls come and go.
Has a responsibility.
She's the leader of the biggest party in Scotland. She is the First Minister of Scotland.
She is, and she has a responsibility to all of Scotland. And this week she reneged on that, and she reneged on that responsibility, and she followed the view and narrow party objective, not the view of the people of Scotland, who have said time and time and time again they do not want dragged back to the divisions of 3 years ago, and they haven't changed their view on the question that they were asked and gave a clear answer on just 3 years ago. Now,
it seems very binary. It's independence, full independence, or the status quo inside the Union. Gordon Brown has suggested, as it were, a sort of third way, whereby a lot of those powers which are coming back to Westminster aren't grabbed by London but are passed straight to Edinburgh. Do you think this is a reasonable idea? A federal Britain might be the way forward?
Well, I think that Gordon Brown is full of thousands of good ideas. It's just a wee shame that he was never Prime Minister and he could have implemented some of them. But in terms of the powers argument, Theresa May has already made it absolutely clear that there is no power that's currently residing at Holyrood that's going to go anyplace else, and that as powers are returned from Brussels to the UK Parliament, they will then be further devolved. Now, it'll be asymmetric devolution, I would expect, because Scotland already has competency over a wider range of issues than the Welsh Assembly and the Stormont Assembly, that there will be more coming there. But that's something that we have to discuss and make sure that we do in a way that doesn't practically impede our own internal market in the UK. And that's why I'm talking about a Brexit process, not just the date on which we actually leave the EU.
Got that. Now, it's been a very, very difficult week for your party. Some high and low moments and some surreal moments as well. What did you think when you saw that George Osborne was going to be editing the London Evening Standard?
Yeah, well, I have to say, I thought, well, he's a better man than me, because I spent 10 years as a journalist, and I've now spent 6 years as a politician, and I'm not sure I could combine them both, because, you know, I work a pretty busy week as it is, and this week in particular, so I'm not sure you can do both at the same time, if I'm honest.
Your previous leader, Sir John Major, has warned Theresa May not to become captured by the so-called hard Brexiteers, and clearly the Chancellor, Philip Hammond, is having a pretty torrid time in the papers at the moment. Are you concerned that there is a kind of growing war inside your party to push out anybody, including people like you, I suppose, who are not hard as hard can be on the Brexit issue?
No, I don't think there's anybody either pushing me, and they'd get shoved back pretty hard if they tried. And also, I think the idea that anybody could capture Theresa May is probably somebody that doesn't know Theresa May very, very well. That's a woman who knows her own mind.
Ruth Davidson, thank you very much indeed for talking to us.
Now, the years since the referendum in 2014 have not exactly been kind to the Labour Party in Scotland, but their leader, Kezia Dugdale, is determined to make a case for the union. I sat down with her this week and I began by asking if Theresa May would be right to block any referendum.
You have to understand that the majority of Scots don't want another independence referendum. That's clear from the opinion polls. It's also clear that they don't want independence from the vote that we had just 2.5 years ago, which is why I've said very clearly that Labour MSPs will vote against a second independence referendum. But here's the thing. If we have to have another referendum, if there must be one, then we've got to make sure that it is a clear choice, that people actually understand what they get, either with independence or with remaining part of the United Kingdom. I can't possibly see how we will have that clarity before Brexit. So Scottish Labour have said very clearly we can't support an independence referendum before Brexit. That's the difference.
So what happens then if, as what's expected, the Scottish Parliament passes the idea of the second referendum next week? What happens then? Will you still be against the idea, or will you actually support what the Scottish Parliament democratically says?
Well, I've said very clearly we'll oppose it here in the Scottish Parliament, and then we have to see what happens next. What I've been absolutely adamant about is that if we have to have this referendum, we have to understand the choice. Nicola Sturgeon's whole argument as to why we're doing this is because of the Brexit result and the fact that people in Scotland voted differently from the rest of the United Kingdom. She's asserting that Scotland could somehow retain the UK's membership of the European Union. She's asserting that Scotland could have a relationship with the single market. None of these things are facts. The reality would be very, very different, and until we have those facts, there isn't a clear choice for Scottish voters, which is why I've said Scottish Labour can't support an independence referendum until we know the outcome of Brexit. I just think that's clear and sensible, and it's what the vast majority of people in Scotland understand and want.
Talking about the Brexit impact on the idea of a second referendum, the SNP do have a point, don't they? Because they were elected on a manifesto that said that there should be a second referendum if there was this change in circumstances. This is a pretty major change in circumstances, so they're right, aren't they?
Well, read the line before that in the SNP's manifesto, where they also say if the majority of opinion shows that Scots want it. And when you actually look at the detail of the opinion polls recently, the majority of Scots don't want another independence referendum. They recognise, as so many other people do, it was just 2.5 years ago, and at that time we'd spent 2 years debating the ins and outs of this on buses and pubs and cafes just like this. And we had that healthy debate, and Scots voted no. And the mandate that we had in that referendum should be respected to this day. And you have to understand, and I think you only can if you live and breathe politics here in Scotland, just how divisive that referendum was, what it did to families and communities. And I think our country's divided enough, quite frankly. I want a First Minister and a Prime Minister focused on uniting our country, not taking us back to these arguments of the past.
One person who seems quite relaxed about the prospect of a second referendum is Jeremy Corbyn. He says it'll be absolutely fine.
And he instantly regretted those comments. I think he understands that it was a clumsy use of language. There's no difference though.
How did you feel when you heard him say that, really, in your heart of hearts? What was your instant reaction?
Well, I was surprised because it was a clumsy phrase, and Jeremy Corbyn and I are absolutely united on this issue. When you hear him talk about independence and the damage it would do, it is so compelling and so persuasive, because he makes the case that the difference between what Scots raise in taxes and what we spend in our public services is £15 billion. So if we were independent, that's £15 billion we would no longer have to spend on our schools and hospitals. So as much as Jeremy is angry at Tory austerity today, he understands that with independence we'd have turbocharged austerity, and that's why he's so against independence, and why we'll be campaigning together against it.
But Jeremy Corbyn's a bit of a liability, isn't he, really? If you look at his approval ratings in Scotland, a recent poll showed that he was at -61 with Labour voters. Ruth Davison, the Scottish leader of the Conservatives, is almost 100 points ahead of him. I mean, he'd be forgiven for wanting to rebuild Hadrian's Wall to stop him coming up.
Look, I wouldn't doubt for a second that Jeremy Corbyn is a very powerful advocate for anti-austerity politics, and actually when you look at the job that Labour's got to do in Scotland, it's got to get back into those working class communities and speak to the people that have left Labour in the past and talk to them about how their future can be different and how you don't need independence to achieve a more equal world. Jeremy Corbyn's a great voice for that and adds a huge amount to the campaign when he comes and he talks to those communities about that anti-austerity agenda.
So he's a great voice, even though he's got approval ratings of -61.
He's a very powerful advocate for the type of policy he advocates that speaks to a particular group of voters, and that's why he's an asset to this campaign.
Who should lead the campaign to stay within the UK?
A difficult question. I think there's a lot of reflection on the EU referendum that's got to be done. I think it's clear that this time round it won't be one particular politician. I think there will probably be a search for... No, I mean, there's obviously plenty of politicians in Scotland who will advocate for remaining part of the United Kingdom. Is there
doesn't
one?
appear to be a standout figure, though, does it?
I don't think you need that, though. I think what might be much better is having a voice from business or a voice from the trade unions, or indeed a particular kind of popular figure from civic or cultural life. I don't yet know who that is. Can't really blame me, given this campaign is just days old for that, but I certainly intend to play a prominent role in that campaign. But I'll be making a Labour case for remaining part of the United Kingdom, and it'll be one rooted in how we resolve poverty and inequality in this country, and one that will expose the false hope that the SNP offer. Because, you know, I walk into the same communities that they do, communities like Craigmillar here in Edinburgh. It's one of the poorest bits of the entire country, and I watch the SNP sell this false hope, this idea that the welfare system can be better, that our schools can be better with independence. How can that possibly be, faced with that deficit, with £15,000 million less to spend on the types of services that those communities and the people within them really rely on?
Kezia Dugdale, the leader of the Labour Party in Scotland. Well, in a few minutes' time, the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, will be joining me in the studio here in Aberdeen. But first, I've been to Edinburgh to ask voters how they are feeling about the idea of referendum round 2. This week, Scotland's First Minister Nicola Sturgeon put the wind up Theresa May by announcing her plans for another referendum on Scottish independence. This sparked a war of words over the timing of the vote, with Mrs May declaring she was determined to govern in the interests of the whole country and defend the precious, precious union. But what do the people in Scotland's capital make of it all? Back in 2014, Edinburgh voted strongly against independence, but in the EU referendum, the nation's capital was Scotland's most pro-Remain city. So Nicola Sturgeon is banking on Brexit changing people's minds in cities like this. Nestled next to the Edinburgh Castle, Tartan Weaving Mill is a 5-storey bastion of Scottish pride. So what better place to test the mood of the people? This idea of a second referendum on Scottish independence, do you think it's a good idea, a bad idea, or you're not really sure?
A bit of 50-50, to be honest with you. It was a very interesting debate only a few years ago when it all happened. Didn't expect it to be coming round again so quickly. So yeah, I mean, we'll have to wait and see how things progress. And do you think Brexit changes things? I think Brexit does change things for a lot of people, yeah, here in Scotland. Obviously, maybe a bit different to how it's been perceived in the rest of the UK.
At the moment, I have not decided exactly which way I want to vote, because it's it's up and down at the moment. But if you ask me the last time, and I was for Scottish independence, but right now I've not decided. I have to look into it again to see where we stand.
And is that because of Brexit changing the picture? Or?
Yes, definitely.
With so many complex factors in play in the run-up to the referendum, unpicking exactly how the nation will vote is nigh on impossible. But down on the shop floor, where they weave the tartan and sew the kilts, the views on the second referendum are much more clearly defined.
A bad idea.
Why is that?
Because we have already voted. I'm Scottish and I'm British, and I'm proud to be British.
Yes, I'm quite happy with the second referendum, no problem with it at all. I think the time is just about right as well, so and I'm looking forward to the debate over the next couple of years or so.
And that debate promises to be long, drawn out and above all bitter, because the stakes could not be higher. After all, we could be witnessing the final unravelling of the very fabric of the United Kingdom.
So some pretty mixed views there in Edinburgh. Well, to discuss all this and more, I'm joined in the studio now by the First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon. Thank you for being with us this morning. So back in 2014, we were all told that the independence referendum was a once-in-a-generation event. So I'm a little bit confused. Just how long do you think a generation is?
I think that's a reasonable question. Of course, Brexit changed everything in 2016, and if we cast our minds back to the 2014 referendum, what we were also told by those campaigning against independence at that time was that a yes vote would jeopardise our place in the European Union and only a no vote would secure it. So the 2016 vote on the EU really was a material change in circumstances. The future of the UK looks very different today than it did 2 years ago. And my argument is quite a simple one. We know as a result of the Brexit vote, change is coming for Scotland. We can't avoid that change now. The question is, what kind of change do we want, and shouldn't we have the right to choose that? Do we want to go down the hard Brexit path, or do we want to choose independence so that we can create a genuine partnership of equals across the British Isles, but also secure our relationship with Europe? So it's about choice. It's about saying to people the future of Scotland really should be decided by Scotland, not decided for us by Westminster governments.
You see, you mount your whole argument on the fact that there's been a change in circumstances because of Brexit. That was in page 23 of your referendum. But at the same time, it does feel a little bit like you're trying to catch people out with the small print. But because what you have also been saying very strongly is that you won't have another referendum until it's clear the majority of Scottish people want it. I'm just going to look, for example, at what you said when you were launching your manifesto in 2016, setting the date for a referendum before a majority of the Scottish people had been persuaded independence is the best future for our country is the wrong way round. And there hasn't been a single poll that shows that's the case. That's changed.
Maybe I'm being old-fashioned here. I don't think manifestos are small print. The manifesto that I was elected on as First Minister, incidentally, with a higher share of the vote across Scottish constituencies of any party in the history of the Scottish Parliament, is really important. And what it said, and you've quoted both of those bits of the manifesto at me, but what it said was the Scottish Parliament should have a right to have another referendum if there is a significant change in opinion or if there is a material change in circumstances.
But I'm also talking about the emphasis that you chose to make when you were standing on the stage. It's the same emphasis that you made, for example, when launching the manifesto and also in those Holyrood TV debates as well.
My manifesto speaks for itself, and anybody can go and look at the terms of the manifesto I was elected on, and that is, you know, yes, we said if there was a material shift in opinion or, and the word or was there, if there is a material change in circumstances, and expressly it said, such as Scotland being taken out of the EU against our will. And we were elected fairly overwhelmingly on the strength of that manifesto. But look, I'm making an argument. Everybody knows I support independence. I don't think I'm telling you anything you don't know. But
no
this is about
state secrets there.
No exclusive for you here. But this is about choice. And, you know, if people in Scotland decide that hard Brexit, the way Theresa May wants to take the UK, is what Scotland wants, that's one thing.
But there's no sign the Scottish people want that choice, is there?
Well, I would actually suggest that there is every sign. I mean, there's been a slew of opinion polls over the past week. You know, there was one showing that a majority of people did think if the Scottish Government said there should be a referendum, then the UK Government should not stand in the way.
But there's been no one saying that the majority of Scottish people want independence, which is what you were talking about. When you launch your manifesto.
I've set out what my manifesto says, and you know, anybody can, they don't have to just listen to me, you can go and check that. And the mandate for the choice I'm seeking to give people now is very clear. It's beyond any shadow of a doubt. But on the question of public opinion, I guess what I'm saying is it should be for people to choose, because we know that Brexit means change now is inevitable. It's about what kind of change do we want and who gets to decide that. If a referendum on independence was to be denied, then effectively the future of Scotland has not been decided by us, it's been decided for us. Now, I should say I don't propose a referendum now. I don't think it would be right to put that choice to the people of Scotland before the terms of Brexit were clearer, much, much clearer than they are now. But I also think it would be fair for people in Scotland, once the terms are clear, to have that choice before it's too late to choose a different course.
Let's talk about that timetable, shall we? Because Theresa May's made it pretty clear that she doesn't accept the timetable you've put on the table, which is by autumn 2018.
No, it's not. It's the earliest autumn 2018.
The earliest autumn 2018. Would you accept her timetable, which is after Brexit?
I don't know what her timetable is. I mean, after Brexit could be from now to never, you know, by definition.
But shall we say, after the Brexit negotiations, after the UK has left the EU, would you then be happy to have a referendum then?
I guess that depends on what that time frame then looks like. I've said, and I've
potentially then.
Well, let me just set out my position clearly. I said yesterday, if Theresa May's concern is timing, then within reason, I'm happy to have that discussion. I've trying to find some consensus here. We both say not now, so we agree on that. I've set out the time frame that I think would be fair and reasonable. She says she doesn't agree with that, so I think it's therefore for her to say what time frame she thinks would be reasonable, and then let's have that discussion. I'm perfectly happy to have that discussion.
So would 2020 be okay?
No, that takes us to the second point I was going to make. I don't think it would be fair for Scotland to have a delay so that it meant that Scotland was taken out of the EU, a long period of time was allowed to elapse, making it much harder then for Scotland, even if it wanted to negotiate a different relationship with Europe. That's why I talk about this, before it's too late for us to choose a different course. So, I've tried very, very hard to compromise with Theresa May over the past number of months. I mean, what viewers outside of Scotland might not be aware of is that we actually put forward a proposal that would have accepted Scotland staying in the UK, coming out of the EU, but protecting our place within the single market, proposing new powers for the Scottish Parliament to try to protect Scotland's interests in a post-Brexit landscape. So we've tried very hard to compromise, and we've met so far with a UK government that's been very intransigent and not willing to enter into that discussion.
Part of Theresa May's concern, of course, will be that this is not the right thing to be hanging over those crucial negotiations. Now, I understand, of course, that you represent people in Scotland. Do you not care at all about the instability about other people in the UK, people from England, Wales and
I do
Northern
care.
Ireland?
I care deeply. I didn't want the UK to be in this position at all. I want the UK to get a good deal from Europe, because that, apart from being in the best interests of people in other parts of the UK, that's also the best interests of Scotland.
But this could be a distraction from that deal.
But I cannot, and I'm not alone here, I cannot simply pretend that I don't have real fears that Theresa May will not get a good deal. She may get a bad deal or no deal, and that even a good deal will be significantly worse than membership of the single market. So this comes to the choice I had to make. I can, choose to let Scotland simply drift through the next 2 years, crossing my fingers, hoping for the best while fearing the worst, or I can try to set out a plan for Scotland now that gives, at the right time, the people of Scotland a choice. And I think it's right to plan to give people in Scotland the choice.
OK, well, let's talk about that plan, shall we? An independent Scotland, in your mind, would you be looking to join the EU as a full member state? You would?
That's long-standing SNP policy.
Even though it's so complicated in order to get to that application. Well, and all you need is one member state to say, no, that's no good, such as Spain, their own issues with separatists, and you'd be at the back of the queue, wouldn't you? Because there is no waiting list.
There is no queue to join the European Union, and we've had several voices over recent times saying that if Scotland wanted to be in the EU, there would be a very open, warm reception for that. Now, I accept that we're in changed circumstances. In 2014, when I was arguing the case for independence, the UK was very firmly in the EU. The UK is now going to be coming out of the EU. So we have to, and set out very clearly to people in Scotland before asking them to make this choice, the route and the process that we would take to transition from where we are now to being in a relationship with Europe that was right for Scotland. So, that's detail that requires to be set out. But I do believe it's right for Scotland to remain within that European family of nations, not instead of trading across the UK, but in addition to that, the single market is massively important. It's massively important to the UK economy. It's very important to the Scottish economy. Geographically, we are on the periphery of Europe. It's really important to be in the single market. It's important for investment and for jobs, to protect the rights of ourselves to follow careers or jobs in other European countries and vice versa. It's important for all of these reasons. So yes, I do think that is important. It's also what people in Scotland voted for.
You say the single market is important. Of course it is important, but 63% of Scottish trade is with the rest of the UK, and that compares to just 16% with the EU. I mean, the real economic risk would be leaving.
No, again, you're asking me very fair questions, and I'll come on to that directly in a second, but I absolutely accept the scrutiny of these positions, because if you think about the Brexit vote, people were asked to vote with no detail whatsoever. 9 months on, it's still Brexit means Brexit is about as much detail as we've got.
I mean, it's a leap into the dark, a bit like the other referendum, isn't it?
I'm determined that it wouldn't be. It would be an informed choice, which is why I say the choice should happen when the terms of Brexit are clear, and also the obligation is on me and those arguing for independence to put forward the detail on what independence looks like. But to come back to your question, because I wasn't trying to dodge it, the trade with the UK, the trade with the rest of the UK is important for Scotland, vitally important for Scotland. It's important for the rest of the UK to trade with Scotland. I'm not proposing staying in the single market instead of that trade. And for those who say, oh, but it would be impossible to trade, an independent Scotland to trade with the UK, I'd make 2 points. We've got a UK government saying that it's going to freely trade with every country in the world. It would be a bit odd if that excluded an independent Scotland. But secondly, you know, the Prime Minister, rightly I should say, I absolutely agree with the comments she makes in this regard, is saying right now to the Republic of Ireland that the UK being out of the EU and the Republic of Ireland being in it does not necessitate a hard border between Ireland and the UK and would not put in place barriers to trade. I simply make the point that it's not credible for the UK government to say that to Ireland, an independent country in the EU, and to somehow pretend that the situation would be different for an independent Scotland.
So what currency then would an independent Scotland have?
We're doing a piece of work looking at this just now. Obviously in 2014 we proposed using the pound within a currency union. The starting point of our consideration is that Scotland would use the pound. It's our currency, it's a fully tradable international currency. But as I'm sure you know, I have a growth commission right now looking at a plan for the economic future of Scotland, but also looking in detail at currency options for Scotland.
So you don't know then? Well, you're calling for a referendum when you're not sure what currency you'd use?
That commission hasn't concluded its work yet, I'm being perfectly frank. Look, a referendum at the earliest is going to be 18 months from now. I absolutely accept, well in advance of that, not just in currency, but on the economic plan, on some of the questions you're asking me on Europe, we will set out a very clear proposition. But I think it's right, given the changed circumstances of Brexit, that we do very serious work before we come to putting that proposition forward. So that work hasn't concluded yet. I said in my speech to the SNP conference yesterday, it will conclude over the next few months, and at that point we will publish its conclusions for public scrutiny and debate. And people, I feel, you know, few people have said, commentators have said that those of us arguing for independence next time round would try to sort of emulate the Leave campaign by putting slogans on the side of a bus and giving no detail. I would not want the future of my country to be decided on that basis. I want people in Scotland to have an informed choice, and that means informed about the implications of Brexit, but also informed about the implications of independence.
And yet you can't say what currency they would use. I mean, so surely that would be something you should work out before calling for the referendum and before going to the Scottish Parliament.
With the greatest respect, a referendum, as we've just been talking about, is at the earliest 18 months away. I'm not asking people to vote today or tomorrow or next week or next month. But what I've said is we're doing detailed work. The starting point of our consideration is that Scotland uses the pound. It's our currency as much as it is the currency of anywhere else. But it's right, we're in very changed circumstances. Brexit changes lots and lots of things, not just for Scotland, but for the UK. So I think people should take some assurance from the fact that we're doing very detailed work on all of these questions, and well in advance of being asked to make a choice, there will be a proposition put forward for people that allow them to make that choice in a very informed way.
Let's talk about the economic realities, because Scotland has a £15 billion deficit. Now, as a percentage of GDP, that is higher than any other EU member state, including Greece. Your economy is growing at a third of the speed of the rest of the United Kingdom. Oil revenues in the last 2 years have fallen by 97%. Be frank. Can Scotland really afford to become an independent country?
Well, I would actually look at that, and perhaps some people would look at that and say, can Scotland afford not to be? Because that deficit, and I want to, because again, these are all absolutely legitimate questions. That deficit is one that has been created on, to use shorthand, Westminster's watch. That's not a feature of life in an independent Scotland. That's what's happened with Scotland as part of the UK.
But you've been in government. You need to take some responsibility for it as well, don't you?
We're not responsible for macroeconomic policy in the Scottish Parliament. I wish we were. We might not be in that position. And of course, the UK and most countries have a deficit, and the UK's got, what, £1.7 trillion of debt, which is separate to deficit. Obviously, but that's my first point. The second point, and this I think is the more fundamental point, that deficit exists whether we're independent or not, which means it has to be dealt with whether we're independent or not. The question there, therefore, for Scotland is, are we better to allow Westminster to keep making the same mistakes that created that deficit in the first place, or are we better to set out an economic plan about how we use the greater economic powers of independence to grow our economy, to encourage more people to come to Scotland, which if we're in the single market and the UK is not, I suspect would be a bit of a magnet for investment, to work out a plan to get to a more sustainable and stronger economic future. And that's the fundamental choice. The deficit can't be magicked away, whatever our constitutional future. It's what constitutional arrangements give us the best ability to deal with that situation.
So you blame Westminster, but at the same time, you get a £26 billion block grant from Westminster as well,
which has been, that's the way we're funded, which has been, if you take from the moment the Tories came to power in 2010 to the end of this decade, that block grant will reduce by 10% in real terms. So Scotland's not independent. And again, this will be a choice.
But you want to reduce it to nothing.
Well, no, because that money goes from Scotland to Westminster and comes back again. So anyway, we're getting overly technical here. The point I'm making is that if Scotland doesn't become independent, and that's a choice for people in Scotland, then what we're facing are continued cuts to our block grant. We're facing more years of austerity. We're facing an impact from the UK leaving the single market that is estimated to cost thousands of jobs in Scotland and to reduce our budget even further. So this is a choice not between some certain future with no difficulties with the UK and lots of uncertainty and difficulties with independence. This is about a future where there are big challenges for Scotland and the UK. How do we best equip ourselves to meet those challenges? And I think staying within the world's biggest single market, giving ourselves the ability to work towards a more sustainable economic future is far better than allowing ourselves to be taken out of that single market by the UK and facing the economics of austerity for more years, just as we have over the past number of years.
There is an argument, isn't there, that talking about an independence referendum is quite convenient for you because it allows you to distract from your domestic record of the SNP. And let's just look at that record for a second. Education standards are slipping. A record number of nations are now doing better than Scotland in terms of that. Life expectancy, 2 years less in the UK. The number of children in poverty is up. The number of pensioners in poverty is up. I mean, it's a welcome diversion, isn't it, from looking at the record of the SNP?
Just very briefly, I don't think you can separate the health of our NHS and education, which is affected by overall public spending and budgets, from these big decisions about whether we're in or out of the single market or independent or not. But
you can't blame it all on Westminster or external forces.
I was about to come on to these. I'm the First Minister. I take responsibility for all of these things. But I was just going to counter some of these. We saw poverty in Scotland and the UK increasing last week, largely down to welfare changes from Westminster. On education, we've got a massive programme of work underway right now to raise standards, to close the attainment gap. We are now seeing improvements in terms of children from more deprived backgrounds doing better in school, going to university. Take the health service, for example. Our accident and emergency departments, under real pressure, in common with others across the UK, are performing 13 percentage points better than accident and emergency departments in England. 90.8% of people in Scotland seen within 4 hours, 77% in England. So on many of these judgments, we are doing better here in Scotland under the Scottish Government than policy south of the border. So I take those responsibilities very, very seriously, but I take my wider responsibilities as First Minister to try to protect Scotland's interests in the bigger picture, if you like, so that we can continue to invest in health and education and continue to work towards the improvements that all of us want to see.
If you're so committed to improving things such as education, why did you only mention it once in your speech yesterday when you mentioned independence?
We've got
13 times?
a massive programme of work underway in education right now. So we're in the process of introducing standardised assessments. We've just announced a £120 million pupil equity fund, putting resources directly into the hands of head teachers. We've got a governance review of education underway. What I did talk about in my speech yesterday was the doubling of childcare provision over this Parliament and our intention to pay childcare staff who work in our nurseries the living wage, so we can attract more people into that profession, value that work, because we know that many of the inequities in education later in a child's education start before they even start school. We've put such an emphasis on increasing early years and childcare provision, and that was one of the key announcements in my speech yesterday, as was investment in mental health. So we're going to increase the access to mental health professionals, not just in our hospitals but in our prisons and police cells. Also announcing investment in my speech yesterday around digital skills. So, you know, you can't just, I know you don't, now that I'm talking about all the things I did announce in my speech yesterday, you want to stop. These were all in my speech yesterday. They're all vital. But all of these things are at risk if we allow ourselves to be taken down that hard Brexit path that is going to be so damaging for our economy and our society.
Now, I'm really interested in this question because you are clearly a formidable politician. You've devoted your life to independence. You've built your reputation over many years. This is a huge personal risk for you, isn't it, the second referendum? If you fail, then just like David Cameron, this could be all you're remembered for.
I just take a simple view. I'm not in politics to, you know, judge everything and what it means for my own individual career.
But you must feel that pressure slightly.
Look, any politician worth their salt, sorry, Sunday morning, that doesn't feel the pressure of the job shouldn't be in that job. So I feel the pressure, I feel far more pressure to make sure we've got a really well-performing health service and to fulfil the commitment I've given around education. These are the things that matter
and what
to
was
me.
What was the formative thing in Nicola Sturgeon's life that meant you were so committed to an independent Scotland?
I grew up when Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister in a part of Scotland, in common with many communities across England and Wales as well, that, you know, was really damaged because of her industrial policy, because of her, you know, approach to many policies. So I grew up with people who, you know, had a sense of hopelessness. Unemployment was very high. And one of the things when I was very young that seemed wrong to me was that all of these policies were being imposed on Scotland when the vast majority of people in Scotland had never voted for Margaret Thatcher's party. So my politics are driven by social justice and building a better country. Independence for me is not the end in itself. It's the means to an end. It's the means to trying to build a better Scotland.
So will you stand down then if you lose this referendum?
You know, I'm not planning to lose. I'm planning to give people in Scotland a choice, and I'm planning to try to persuade them to make what I consider to be the right choice. And, you know, after we've had it, I'll be perfectly happy to come back and answer those questions. But it's not a question that I'm going to engage with right now.
I was hoping you would, but
I know
never mind.
you were, but, you know,
not quite an answer
you know
there.
better.
Nicola Sturgeon, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
I've been